Hello, I'm Rachel Eads, a member of the Baltimore Lambda Alpha chapter, and welcome to today's webinar. In the summer of 2022, the New York Times published a story about an African-American couple, professors at Johns Hopkins University, whose home in a prominent Baltimore neighborhood was appraised surprisingly low. Suspecting something amiss, the couple removed all family pictures and African-related art and decoration, had a white friend meet another appraiser at the home, and received a second appraisal that was $278,000, or almost 60% higher. This alerted Lambda Alpha members to a significant real estate issue and led to the organization of a series of webinars on residential appraisal bias. This series follows an earlier one from LAI based on Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. The book showed how laws and policies in the United States have been used to create and perpetuate structural inequities. The roots of these practices can be traced to some of LAI's most distinguished early leaders, including Richard T. Ely and Homer Hoyt, who developed redlining and formalized appraisal practices. Today's webinar is the fourth in our series on residential appraisal bias. We have previously presented sessions from Dr. Jania Howard about her research confirming appraisal bias, by the Appraisal Foundation's Vice President, Lisa Desmarais, on professional appraisal standards, and by James Park, representing the Federal Interagency Task Force on Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity, or PAVE, as it's called. These are about federal regulatory measures and recommendations to address the issue. Recordings of all these previous webinars are available through the LAI website, lai.org, and it's linked to YouTube. Today's session is being sponsored jointly by Lambda Alpha International and by the New York LAI chapter. I'm joined by Chris Deutsch, president of the New York chapter, who will introduce our speakers. This presentation will be followed by an opportunity to ask questions. So those of you in the audience, please send me questions through the chat. Chris, thank you for sharing in the organization of these webinars and for inviting our speakers today.
Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate this opportunity. I'm Christopher Deutsch, the president of the New York City chapter of the Lambda Alpha International. And I would like to welcome our two guest speakers, Craig Steinley and Jonathan Miller. Craig has, hold on a second. Craig is primarily provides litigation support and services in his practice, typically involving review for standards compliance, various regulatory matters, and in the appraisal of complex property. Craig was the 2021 Vice President of the Appraisal Institute and continues as a member of its executive committee. He's serving as the 2023 President of the Appraisal Institute, and he's also served on the Appraisal Institute's National Board of Directors since 2014 and is an AQB certified, or Appraisal Qualifications Board certified, USPAP instructor. Jonathan Miller is the president and CEO of Miller Samuel Incorporated, which is a real estate appraisal and consulting firm he co-founded in 1986. He's a state certified real estate appraiser in New York and Connecticut, performing testimony as an expert witness in various local, state, and federal courts. He holds the Councils of Real Estate designation. Miller Samuel provides appraisal services on roughly $5 billion worth of property per year in the New York City metropolitan area. He's also an author of a series of market reports considered the report of record covering the New York City metropolitan area, Boston, Florida, Southern California, and Aspen, and are relied upon by the media, financial institutions, and government agencies. Jonathan, if you would, I would be happy if you go ahead and take it away.
Well, thank you, Christopher, and welcome everybody. The purpose of this is to provide an engaging conversation about essentially the state of the profession and issues of bias. But first, I want to delve into a little bit about the appraisal industry itself and how we got in. Both Craig and I got into it. I've always marveled at how the consumer and the public doesn't fully understand what role appraisers play in the home buying process, the mortgage process, and so hopefully we can shed a little light on this. I have known Craig for quite a while, and he's a good friend, and also he's a residential focused appraiser. There's sort of two classifications really, residential and commercial, and we're both on the residential side, so we sort of speak the same language. Craig, I actually don't know this, but I was just wondering how you got into appraising, because it always seems by accident, and I thought maybe you could give me some thoughts on that.
Thank you, Jonathan, and I want to echo the sentiment of thanks to the entire team here for putting this webinar on and allowing us to discuss the profession, what we do, which seems to be a mystery to a lot of folks, and maybe helping understand a little bit more about some of the positive things that are going on to make sure that the population of appraisers looks more like the communities that they serve. I was born into a real estate family. I've always been fascinated by real estate. My father was a broker, had a very large brokerage firm in Rapid City, South Dakota, where I now reside. And at the time I was in higher education, I was teaching at a university, mathematics and computer science after obtaining advanced degrees there. And kind of on that dual track of being involved in listing and selling properties to get myself through college and afterwards, and then teaching, and ultimately the allure of real estate and the mathematics behind appraisal and supporting appraisal in a very good way was a draw that kind of led me away from the rigor and stodginess of academia, as I like to say, to the free loving world of being involved in the appraisal of real estate. So really I have to blame it on my family, I guess, Jonathan.
Yeah, I haven't heard free loving as a descriptor for the industry, but I did jot that down.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And in some ways, I quit a management job for a company that was eventually was acquired by Marriott. I wanted to be in the hotel business. That's what I went to college for. And I became a real estate agent, and at a Century 21 in the western suburbs of Chicago. And I kept interacting with appraisers. And then I ended up moving to Manhattan. That's a 5-hour story, so I'll leave it there. But I ended up becoming a sales agent on a new condo, and I saw these appraisers coming in. It really intrigued me because Manhattan is a market that doesn't have a multiple listing system. And at that time, this is back in '86, data was not public record. So it was a very, difficult market to value. And I found the appraisers just had no information, or very little. They were overly reliant on real estate agents who, of course, are conflicted in a transaction, with the commission. And so we started our firm to try to fill that gap. When I was in college, I didn't even know what an appraisal was. So that's interesting.
If I could pull on the Century 21 thread just for a moment, my father's firm was actually acquired by a Century 21 conglomerate that came in, and at that time I went to work for them as well as
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it was
Did you
actually,
wear the gold polyester jacket?
yeah, that was a requirement. I was
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
the manager for the office of 52 agents and 13 support staff. That was in a prior life, I like to say. But managing that group, I was responsible for the pricing of all of the inventory that came out, and so it was really that
Interesting.
step into appraisal that was interesting to me. So, like you, have a background in brokerage and thought that it was greener on the other side of the fence where the appraisers were doing their work. I
Yeah,
also,
we're more analytical, or we, I'm not criticizing the brokerage community, but it's the idea of, I loved working with numbers, and I get that impression from you. We're math nerds.
that's right.
Um, uh, so just sort of the next logical step is, when people think of an appraiser, they think of somebody working for a bank, right? And valuing the collateral for the purpose of a loan being issued to the consumer, or the buyer, or the refinance. And that is sort of the stereotype of what appraisers are, and it represents, certainly probably the largest portion of residential work that residential appraisers in the U.S. undertake. But what are some other client types that you work with? I'd be curious to see who your clients are.
Jonathan, I think like you, we do rely initially on the mortgage lending work for the office, particularly when you have an office like mine that has additional individuals that you get to work with that are part of the team. And I think that the thing that most members of the public don't realize is that, and you mentioned this, unlike the brokers, even the title insurance companies that are paid if a closing occurs, everyone in a transaction really is being paid based on a certain outcome, a closing typically, but there are other things. Even a lot of the folks in the mortgage lending business are paid, at least for the longest time, on whether the loan closes. They end up with a additional commission or bonus. And the appraisers in the transactions are the only one that are independent. We like to say that it doesn't matter if the lender hires us or the buyer or the seller. The result is going to be the same, because you do need some independence in that loaded transaction to sort of sort out the facts so that a good lending decision or a good purchase or selling decision can be made. So that leads into the answer to your question, which is really anyone who's involved in the real estate ecosystem. It could potentially be a client. We work for a lot of attorneys that are involved in adverse matters, litigation where someone is unhappy with someone else, and there's a real estate matter that's at the center of that dispute. In my area of the country, we work for a lot of tax authorities when outside appraisers from outside the particular area come in and are arguing about the taxable value, the assessed value in our jurisdiction of a particular property, usually a larger piece of property. Then the taxing authorities that may not have the expertise and nuanced knowledge to actually provide a reasoned appraisal that can withstand scrutiny from someone on the other side who has an adverse interest in that, may hire appraisers. Personally, I've been involved with a lot of the appraiser regulators looking at the work of appraisers as they are trying to get a brand new credential or upgrade their credential to a higher level, because the state appraiser boards, not all of them have expertise that will allow someone to make a determination about whether or not the appraiser followed our standards. Christopher made reference to USPAP, the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice. It's the one thing, Jonathan, that binds us all together. We all have to follow USPAP. We may have a different opinion about value, but the thought is, if we all follow the same set of standards and we can all say that we were compliant with USPAP, that the variation in values and opinions of values really will be significantly reduced compared to the Wild West days when we didn't have standards and people just did kind of whatever they wanted in appraisal.
Right, right. And I think I came into the profession in the mid 80s, right after it started formalizing the sort of the standards. I mean, it's always been a work in progress. It's interesting. I'm in we couldn't be more opposite in the markets we cover.
Mhm.
You're in South Dakota, I'm in Manhattan, where we have the highest per capita lawyer count in the country. And so a big part of our sort of non-bank work, and actually, frankly, the majority of our practice is legal support services. We do court testimony. We work for a lot of, basically, like you described it, people that are unhappy with someone else's performance. We do a lot of matrimonial work, a tremendous amount, and in that case, probably 90% of our matrimonial work, we're actually hired by both parties because our branding is we are neutral. We don't care about your problems. We just want to come up with what is a reasonable value for the real estate. And it's kind of interesting. We do some crazy stuff, like we value a lot of hallway space where you have two apartments at the end of the hallway, and one owner buys out the other owner, and they want to buy that 5x6 square piece of hallway to make the combination of the two apartments. That's a whole market. It's a different kind of value. It's more about another type of value than market value. But we value, because we're in a multifamily market, 98% of our residential are essentially apartments, co-ops, condos, et cetera. And so we value damage caused by smell, sound, all kinds of things beyond just sort of a traditional appraisal, which we do plenty of it well. When I think of appraising, I think of it as valuing or coming up with a value of the collateral as of a moment in time. And it's a perishable product that, 2 years from now, the market may be different, but, so the appraisal they may need to update it for whatever reason. But it is a temporary number. And I think the last thing that I think is really important for sort of people outside of the appraisal work to understand is in the appraisal, in the mortgage world, the appraiser generally isn't doing the appraisal for the buyer, the consumer that's paying an appraisal fee at mortgage application. The client is the bank, to make to provide them a benchmark to make a rational lending decision on the collateral, which is the home. And we are not working for the broker, the borrower, the buyer, the seller. We are working for the bank. And I think that understanding has gotten better over the years, but I know when I first started, that was not commonly understood, which I found fascinating. I don't know if you've had any experience with that.
That is a key point that practitioners run into quite frequently, because as you note, when you are applying for a mortgage on your property, either to purchase a new property or to refinance for some reason, you write a check for that appraisal typically up front. The lender wants to make sure that cost, as well as some others, are covered. And so it's a natural inference that if I'm writing a check for an appraisal,
You're the client.
yeah, I'm directly involved and have rights and access to that appraiser and can ask questions. But there is a firewall up just to make sure that the appraiser can remain independent. The client, as you say, is typically the lender in a mortgage transaction. And that means that when a homeowner or a buyer that's trying to get a mortgage has questions or concerns about an appraisal report that they have in front of them, they have to go through their lender. They can't call the appraiser direct often about questions pertaining to value, because the lender has to be the intermediary in between to make sure that independence is preserved. And when people buy a product, I wrote a check for the appraiser. For the appraisal, I should be able to talk to the appraiser. It's a common sense problem versus a legal problem, typically, where common sense would say you can talk to the appraiser all you want and ask questions, but the legalities of lending now and the regs around that require us to work through the lender to interact with the person that may be relying on that appraisal so that their mortgage needs can be fulfilled.
Yeah, the way that I think of it, just sort of the common retort from me or my staff is, if that ever comes up, it's not who pays for the appraisal, it's who engages the appraiser, and that's a big difference. So interesting. I was just curious. Sometimes I see our industry in many ways as sort of I've said this many times, an army of lone wolves, where you're kind of on your own. You have organizations like the Appraisal Institute, or your local chapters and whatever, but you're kind of on your own. You're not in an office. For the most appraisers aren't in an office sitting next to other appraisers. Some are, like you have a larger staff and I have a larger staff, but many are just sole proprietors and they don't have that. So they're sort of can feel under siege sometimes when people are asking questions like that. Anyway, interesting. So this is, now we get to like my passion topic, which is something that I've been writing about for the last 5 or 6 years, is why do you think there is such a lack of diversity in the appraisal profession? You and I are sort of the stereotypical, middle-aged, not a person of color. Why is our industry generally like this? And just a stat, in 2021, the Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks 400 professions in the U.S. and the 400th, meaning the dead last in diversity, was appraisers. And we are, depending on the year, but in 21, it was 98% white. And why is that? Why is that condition? Why does that condition exist?
Well, Jonathan, you've hit upon, I think, as you say, the main reason we're here to talk about things today. And there are various opinions among professionals in the appraisal ecosystem about whether or not appraisers are biased. Some say, I've never met a biased appraiser. Appraisal, by definition in the uniform standards, is someone who's independent, impartial, and objective. And the standards also says that bias is an inclination that inhibits your ability or prohibits your ability to be independent, impartial, and objective. So even on a definitional basis, appraisers and bias are exactly the opposite. And so when appraisers hear this concern about appraisal bias, it's counterintuitive or antithetical to what they've learned. But the statistic that you quote, among others, is something that cannot be pushed aside. We are the least diverse profession, at least at that time. It's gotten somewhat better, and I hope we get some of the initiatives that are helping with that. But at the time that this bubbled up to the surface, as Rachel said in the beginning of the conversation, there's a couple in Baltimore, and there are couples throughout the country where these stories have popped up, and any one of them that happens is one too many, in my view. It does indicate this, at least a feeling that somehow an individual believes that the color of their skin affects the value of their home, and that it should never be the case in our profession. So what has caused that? That was your question. When appraisers began prior to the savings and loan bailout bill in the late 1980s, called FIREA, which is an federal acronym that stands for the legislation that was passed at that time to make sure that the financial waves from the S&L bailout didn't occur again in our economy. They created a system at that time. Before that, to get an appraiser's license in some states was impossible because they didn't exist. In my state, South Dakota, if you were a real estate broker, as long as you could find a stamp and an envelope and a piece of paper, and as long as you wrote to the right address for the real estate commission, you would say, I'm a broker, please send me my appraiser's license. That was the only qualification. Well, that all changed after the savings and loan bailout. And the FIREA legislation was passed because Title 11 or Chapter 11 of that federal legislation put into place a regulatory scheme that involved the state governments, the federal government, and a private nonprofit known as the Appraisal Foundation. When that was set up, and as that has evolved, it put in place a system, the supervisor trainee system, where in order to get into our profession, you had to know someone that would open the door for you. There had to be a supervisor that would agree to train you. And as you know from your experience, Jonathan, the current scenario that the regulators at the states have set up makes it so that training someone is not an enhancement initially into the way that your office functions. It's not a profit center. It's actually a labor of love or a labor of benevolence to bring someone into the profession. So
Or sacrifice, right?
So to your question, when you set up a system where you have to know someone to get in, it's not surprising that over time we would develop into a more homogeneous profession where everyone sort of looked like each other because those are the folks that were getting into the door. And in 2010, in fact, the Appraisal Institute, the largest representatives for appraisers across the country, began sounding this alarm bell. We put together a scholarship for minority applicants for appraisers and for women, because we knew that the system that was in place would not allow for a grand diversity across the profession that was definitely needed. So the statistics that you cite are irrefutable. It is a profession that needs more diversity. And as a result of the spotlight and the work that we've done starting in 2010, there are a number of initiatives that are in place now to make finding that open door a lot easier for folks. They don't necessarily have to find a traditional supervisor anymore. There are alternative paths that will allow them into this great profession that you and I really have been enamored with for most of our lifetimes.
Yes, and I appreciate the history of the how this evolved, because I think that's so important. I think when we talk about appraisal bias, we're conflating two concepts. One is just physical, valuation, issues that we're reading. We've read these, dozen or so cases. They're going to court, and where the scenario that you described earlier, or that was described in our introduction, is something that has been repeated over and over again. And then you have the other issue, which is what we just talked about, which is a profession that is very homogenous. And you and I are like poster children for it. Like, we fit the profile, right? We're, middle-aged, Caucasian, male, like we really are. But on the other hand, it's hard as the individual appraiser, like I was saying, working out of their basement, out of their house. It's hard for them to say, and we see a lot of that, say, hey, I'm not biased and none of my colleagues are biased. Whether they are or not, in my mind, is hard to go into that line of discussion when we're like 98 or 93 or 95% white, and 70+% male. It's hard to sort of have a defensible position. And so I look at it as a two-step process. I don't mean to go on like this, but I see it as we have to solve, the 95% number ASAP. Like, it's hard to solve anything else because it's all up to the 75,000 individuals. But the structure of administration, licensing has to be solely focused on changing the math of the profession over the next decade. That's my soapbox on this, but I think it's important. So now that we've talked about this, and you've touched on the sort of the structure of the profession, which is the mentoring, the mentorship, that, and I can't emphasize I don't know if you've had this experience in South Dakota, but in New York, we found that for someone, we hire as a trainee, um, uh, it takes 2.5 to 3 years for them to get their license in New York. Now it takes them 2 years, 1 to 2 years to get all their experience and all that. But the sort of the government system is just, there's no incentive for speed. And I don't know if any appraisers that are watching this are aware, but you can actually reach out to the appraisal subcommittee, and they have liaisons with all the state departments of the 50 states and 5 municipalities, and they can find out what the holdup is, because we found it's very untenable to be able to grow your practice, or replace somebody that left if you have to wait 2 or 3 years to
Yeah.
replace them.
Well,
I don't know if you've run into that.
Oh, of course. And the other thing that I want to make clear to the viewers today, the LAI viewers of the webinar, is that the appraisal profession, if you are a practitioner with your own business, particularly on the residential side, is such that it when you bring someone in as a trainee, it is not a revenue source for the company. When I was managing a large brokerage office, I knew almost to the penny every time I hired somebody in and started training them what they were going to help the company grow with in terms of a bottom line, because over the years we developed averages, and people would come into brokerage and their friends and family would suddenly be listing and selling properties. But what people outside of the appraisal profession don't know is that this regulatory regime that was set up to become a practitioner, Jonathan, that you just mentioned, that takes several years to get through, also requires that a trainee for the longest period of time can't really do anything on their own. You can't send them to do work that you would normally do yourself, so that you're each working on a project and you're getting twice as much done in that period. It turns out for the longest time, due to the requirements of this regulatory regime, that you are actually doing less work yourself as you're training, and obviously the trainee is not producing any income for the firm either. So it is a calculated decision to bring under the current scheme, to bring professionals into the profession. So we have a system that you have to know someone to find an open door, and you have to convince them to train you, because economically it doesn't make a lot of sense for them. The appraisers didn't set that up. Jonathan and I and the colleagues in appraisal didn't get together and set that up, but rather that was a regulatory regime that was enacted by the federal government and then filtered down to the state levels, where each state has to have a licensing body in the state that grants certificates that show that you can appraise. And that whole system was created up outside of of our purview, so to speak. But the reality is that it's produced what we have now. And probably before too much time goes by, we should talk about what we're doing to correct that inequity.
Yes,
But
yes,
we
I'd
got
like
here,
to.
yeah, we got here
No,
not
I'd
on
like.
the accord.
No, I'd like. So before we do, I just want to touch on one other thing that has an implication for solving the diversity challenge in the profession, and that is appraisal management companies, AMCs, which came about after the financial crisis. I mean, they've been around prior to that, but they became ubiquitous to the point where they went from about 15% of residential appraisal orders to appraisals to at one point we're 90%. Now they're not quite 90%, but they're still the vast majority of residential work. So I thought maybe you could share with us what is an AMC and what impact that has had on the profession since basically the financial crisis.
Yeah, and we've had several financial crises, but this goes back to the savings and loan crisis that we had in the late 1980s, when interest rates were up at 16, 17, 18%, and all that went with that. And savings and loans really had a difficult time. Eventually, the entire federal backstop, the Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation, for for savings and loans was bankrupt, and it required a bailout at the federal level. The first president, George Bush, I remember him talking about, it cost the country about $350 million with an M, and that was a lot of money back in those days in the late 80s. And it would involve a couple hundred institutions. Well, in the end, we bailed out over 1,000 savings and loans, and the actual number was quite a bit higher than that $500 million. And as a result of that, the regime that was created, as you're pointing out, really required in some very notable cases an absolute firewall between the appraiser and the person who ordered the mortgage, so that there was not a direct communication path between the mortgage originator and the appraiser. There was this way of creating a firewall that could be done internally by a bank that had a large presence and had staffing to create that independent appraiser ordering department. But in general, they outsourced that to these companies that were called appraisal management companies. Essentially, the idea was, here's an order for an appraisal. It happens to be in Rapid City, South Dakota. I'm going to hire this company called an AMC to go find an appraiser in Rapid City, South Dakota. We don't have to mess with appraisal lists as a lender. We don't have to do any of the internal management.
Right. Make sure their license is current.
Yes.
They have E&O insurance, right?
They're credentialed, have E&O insurance, and have a good track record. And also then when the appraisal comes back to the appraisal management company, the AMC, they, one of the things that they tell their clients, the lenders, is that they'll do USPAP compliance work on it, make sure the appraisal is well supported. And so essentially it's a turnkey for the lender. Here's a fee, go find an appraiser who will do an appraisal and come back to me with that. And what happens in between, I've outsourced that. Well, the issue with AMCs has been, of course, with their dominance, that there are fine AMCs, there are those that are not, and that have developed a reputation that's different than we would like. And so the practical application is, if Jonathan is the lender and he hires me to do an appraisal, I can't talk directly to Jonathan. So I can't talk to Jonathan. I have to talk to an AMC who talks to Jonathan. It's the old game of telephone, where I tell something to the person next to me and they tell it to the person next to them. By the time it finally gets to my client, Jonathan, it's something completely different than I asked. And at the same time,
and just to interject there just for a second, I'm sorry.
Sure.
Often the person that you're dealing with is a 19-year-old person that doesn't know what a mortgage is and is chewing gum. Like you're not dealing with a professional, somebody that you might have dealt with at a bank. And the other point I want to make about AMCs, you're right, they're good, they're bad. I'm not against the AMC sort of structure. It's the bad actors. But when the consumer pays for an appraisal at their application, they think that whatever the fee is going to the appraiser. And the problem is, since this proliferated after the recent, the financial crisis 15 years ago, is that that 50 to 70% of that fee goes to the management company, not to the appraiser. And I don't know about you, if you've ever sort of considered being a Hollywood actor, but can you imagine your agent taking 50% or 70% of the multi-millions you would get for being in a movie, instead of customary more like 10%, right? And so what that has also done, in addition to sort of the firewall that's been created, is that it's also changed the face of appraising, meaning that you were talking earlier about, like, you take on a trainee and you have to sort of suffer for 2 years. The trainee has to suffer for 2 years because they're not making what they eventually will be making. You're taking a risk and carrying them for 2 years because many banks won't take trainee appraisals. And then on top of it, you throw that the fees that you're getting now can be cut in half, where the AMC is dominating the residential sort of appraisal ordering world. And so how hard it becomes to bring people into your practice, let alone think about, and implement diversity practices, when you're financially, you're in far different shape than you were, prior to this practice coming into sort of the daily lives of appraisers.
Right.
That's my soapbox on AMCs.
Well,
Anyway, yeah, go ahead.
First of all, I've not considered being a Hollywood actor, so I'll leave that up to you, Jonathan. But I do take your point about the way in which the fees are divided. And I hope for the listeners and the participants here today, you can see that there are all these things that have been put in place that inhibit the appraiser communicating directly with the client or with the homeowner or buyer in the case of a mortgage. And they all seem necessary at the time, but like everything with a pendulum, sometimes things swing too far and then they come back and swing too far the other way. And it feels like that the profession has to correct some problems has been really
Created more.
disadvantaged in terms of trying to bring more people into the profession to solve the other issue, which is the issue we're talking about now, the diversity of professional appraisers.
Well, Craig, let's get to that. Like, okay, so provided the lay of the land of like what appraiser's role is, what they're experiencing. Now, we're trying to sort of solve or vastly improve the lack of diversity in our profession, which ultimately leads to the perception of bias or the creation of bias, right? I mean, what steps are happening now? For example, what is the Appraisal Institute look forward to sort of as a solution to or an ongoing solution to this challenge?
So the first thing that we have to do for the existing practitioners, and we have done, is we've gotten firmly behind the requirement for additional education in the area of anti-discrimination and fair housing for appraisers. Unlike brokers, for example, real estate brokers, appraisers don't have in their core curriculum any training on fair housing laws and anti-discrimination. And so I'm a firm believer, the Appraisal Institute has been a firm believer in making requirements. And as you know, Jonathan, there are now requirements coming up where all appraisers are going to have to take an initial sequence of training in those two areas, anti-discrimination and fair housing laws. And then on an ongoing every 2-year renewal basis, because we typically have continuing education requirements every 2 years in most states, most jurisdictions. We have to have additional training. So for the current workforce, we've got solidly behind that. In terms of bringing new people into the profession and opening the doors for them, the first thing is something called the Appraiser Diversity Initiative, which is a partnership of the Appraisal Institute, Fannie and Freddie, and the National Urban League. And it was funded initially by Chase Bank with a $3 million contribution. Flagstar contributed another $1 million. We have several other benefactors who have helped us in this. But here's the Appraiser Diversity Initiative story. We have sought out folks who have been trying to get into this profession for a period of time, who were blocked at the door, who couldn't find that open door. And we've provided large amount of scholarship money to them to be able to take the education component of getting a new certificate. If you want to become an appraiser, you have to take classroom education, which is called qualifying education. You have to get an experience check mark. You've got some experience, typically with a supervisor. You have that supervisor trainee model that we've been sort of talking about here that's inhibited diversity. And then the final piece is you have to take the state exam. So the scholarships that we've offered have helped people get through the qualifying education. We've given full ride scholarships for QE. We've given 531, I think is the last number. In just
really?
In the last 18 months or so, we've really engaged.
Really? That's impressive.
Yeah.
I didn't realize it was that large.
Yeah, and I've met many of the ADI winners. I was in Las Vegas where they had a workshop of these people that came together who are trying to get into the profession. I met, and this is this is really where the rubber meets the road. I met a CPA who for 7 years has tried to get into the profession and couldn't find an open door. And through the ADI scholarship and the networking that we provided, they're now working with a supervisor. I met a nurse assistant in an anesthesiologist assistant in a same-day surgery center. I met a teacher. I met someone who was a mortgage originator at JP Morgan Chase. I met someone who has for a long time been involved in medical billing. These are professionals who have been working, who had an interest in the appraisal profession like you and I did, Jonathan, but they couldn't find an open door. And through the ADI
Couldn't find a
scholarship
mentor,
program,
basically.
couldn't
That's
find a
the
mentor. Yeah. Couldn't
so
find a mentor.
just to go on to sort of another way. There's something out there that has come up. It's been bandied about for a bunch of years, but it seems to be actually happening. Is PAREA, which is sort of a way to bypass needing a mentor. And by the way, the mentoring program, meaning the 2-year training that has created the lack of diversity, in my opinion, comes out of the Appraisal Foundation, and sort of the way that the repetition of the way that sort of it has evolved, and so I've been highly critical of the Appraisal Foundation because the mentoring issue is the big issue, and we're one of the only professional services that require this 2-year starvation period for new people into the profession. And it's just because they've been used to it that, in my view, I'm not asking for your view on this. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I feel very strongly that that's where we have to start. But with PAREA, what is the concept behind it? And I know that Appraisal Institute has an initiative about that. Can you explore that a little bit with me?
You bet. And I want to be mindful of the time. I know our hosts probably want to get some questions as well. So let me try to be as brief as I can.
We have 5 more hours, Craig. We're going to go on.
We haven't told them that part. Yeah.
Right.
You and I will go offline and continue to dialogue.
Yeah.
So when the regulatory regime was set up with PAREA back in the late 1980s, implemented in the early 1990s, it required each state to have a state regulatory body, typically an appraiser board, that would grant licenses and certificates to appraisers. It set up something that the federal government has. It's an agency called the Appraisal Subcommittee that oversees the state regulators to make sure they're complying with PAREA. And the third component, which you've just mentioned, is the nonprofit called the Appraisal Foundation, which is a standard setting and qualification setting body. They set the standards for us to follow, USPAP, and they also set the qualifications to get into the profession. Recently, and I mentioned before, the 3 things you have to do to become an appraiser, to get a certificate or a license. You have to take qualifying education. You have to get an experience component, which required in the past a supervisor, traditional supervisor, trainee, or mentoring model, as you call it, Jonathan. And then you have to take the state exam, the national exam, and those are harder depending upon the credential level that you want to obtain. The experience component is where PAREA, which stands for Practical Applications of Real Estate Appraisal, comes into play. The Appraisal Foundation decided that not only would they allow a supervisor trainee model to continue, but they would add this alternate path for people to get their experience component. And it is a simulated and virtual way of getting your experience. It's been compared to a flight simulator for appraisers. Essentially, you look at a property virtually online, you take a tour, you can click on various components and more information pops up. You're given data about that particular market. You have live access to an MLS and to county records for that area. You really do what appraisers do in a simulated and virtual way. And then you write an appraisal report, which is graded. And you do that over and over again. Look at a property, learn about the market where it is, and write an appraisal report that supports your value. There are what's called mentors in the beginning that help you through. But in the end, the mentors cannot help the students at all. It's completely independent work. And by going through a PAREA module, depending on which credentialing level they want, they get a complete check mark for experience. They no longer have to go find a supervisor that will open the door. They did that in a simulated and virtual way online. And for a lot of young people getting into the profession who have learned that way through high school and college, that's a natural thing for them to do, to get their experience credit in that simulated and virtual way. The Appraisal Institute is the only one who's the first to market. It's the only PREA program out there. I do want to talk very briefly about how successful PREA is. We've got it launched in September. We have over 100 people now going through PREA, and we have 1,100 that are completing the steps. It's called a readiness checklist. You have to prove that you have college degree, for example. You have to prove that you have all of your qualifying education out of the way, because unlike the traditional path, you have to have all your education out of the way before you can enter the PREA experience module. So we have over 1,100 that are going through the readiness checklist, 100 who have popped through that already and are in PREA. And here's the amazing thing, and for the reader or for the listeners who've held on all this time, half of the PREA participants, half are women. You heard Jonathan say earlier that the profession now is only 30% women. So we see half of them are women. Less than 65% of the participants are Caucasian. That means 35% are of different racial or ethnicity backgrounds. And that's exactly what we want. We want people who felt like they couldn't find an open door to get in. And here's a final statistic that I'll share with you. 1/3 of the participants say that when they're finished and have their credential, they're going to serve a rural area. In my neck of the woods in South Dakota, we have large swaths where there isn't an appraiser at all. So to say, I'm going to serve in this area that's underserved, and I'm going to find a supervisor first to train me. There are no appraisers, so there are no supervisors in that area. So it's beautiful that the PREA program will allow them to get their experience, to have a credential, and to go serve these underserved and rural markets. It's really doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is to allow the profession to look more like the communities that it serves. And Jonathan, that's the good news story for our profession, I think.
Well, that's congratulations on that initial success, and that is spectacular news. I had not heard that, so it seems to be accomplishing what the mentoring program does not. So, congratulations to the Appraisal Institute. I think now it's time to.
Yep.
Oh yeah, Rachel's on.
Right. I'm appreciate all your good information, and especially this end of some of the very practical steps that are being taken. Let me try to get you a few questions,
Sure.
especially for the people who've been watching us. Sure. One of them is just a straightforward. Does the Appraisal Institute recognize Dr. Jania Howell's findings? And you don't have to elaborate, but just a sort of straightforward reaction to those findings.
Absolutely. We've published a white paper on all of the studies, including Dr. Junia Howell and Professor Corbett Glenn's study. And that white paper talks about the advantages and disadvantages of each of the studies. It was done by a group of academia folks that are members of the Appraisal Institute, and I encourage you to go to appraisalinstitute.org and search for that white paper. So we definitely have recognized and talked about that study, as well as several others that have looked at this problem of a lack of diversity in the profession.
And also, that's the website to go to if you're interested in finding out more about PREA, the AI program. Okay.
There's appraisalinstitute.org has a PREA landing page, PAREA, and it's appraisalinstitute.org, where you can find out more about that path to getting into the profession.
Good.
Fantastic.
Good. Let's see, another question. The Uniform Standards of USPAP has a set of rules.
You said that like a pro, by the way. You said that like a pro.
I've been listening. They have a set of rules coming into place in a few weeks. And these standards have only changed a few times in the last several decades. So it seems like an historic moment now in the appraisal industry. Can you expand on what you think are the key changes in this ethics rule in 2024 that you would like people impacted by appraisals to know about?
Boy, that almost seems like someone provided a question that I might have written. So thank you for that. So in 2024, for the first time in 4 years, our USPAP standards are changing. There's a 2-year kind of shelf life on those typically. And I've already been teaching the required update class that appraisers have to take every 2 years on USPAP. And this year, starting in October of this year, we're talking about, Rachel, exactly what you said, the new 2024-2025 USPAP that has a complete section in the ethics rule. It used to have 3 sections and now it has 4, and it's called the non-discrimination section of the ethics rule, and it lays out in 19 paragraphs, which we study one by one, the areas that appraisers can find themselves either implicitly or unconsciously, or sometimes explicitly, and there's no room for those appraisers in our profession, but unconsciously, if we're biased, these rules that have been enacted will help us to understand that. I have a preference for a certain type of home, and I want to make sure that that doesn't influence the way I appraise other styles of home simply because I like, a certain type of home that I purchase. So unconscious bias is something we're trying to root out as well.
Good. Okay. What is the goal of the Appraisal Institute in 10 years to change the 98% number? And you've talked about how you're going about it, but any more specifics that you may not have said that we should know about?
Well, that number is improving because of these programs that Jonathan and I have just talked about, the ADI program and the PREA program. But the goal in 10 years would be the same as the goal today, which is just to make the profession more look like the populations that it serves. Let me give you an example of that. In South Dakota, it's on a per capita basis, certainly on a landmass basis, it's the largest number of tribal lands that exist in the United States. And there is not a single Native American appraiser working in those areas for appraisals on tribal lands. It's a nuanced skill, but there's an example with the PREA program with ADI where we believe that we'll have many appraisers on tribal lands who have grown up in that area, who understand the local economic influences on real estate, geographic and zoning influences. And as a result of that, we'll have more appraisers that people recognize when they come to their door. They won't just be folks that look like the stereotypical Jonathan and Craig. So that's the goal, and I appreciate that question as well.
Good. Here's a sort of specific question. Who weeds out bad AMCs?
That's a great question. AMCs are licensed by the states, much like appraisers. So they're subject to complaints from consumers and other users of appraisal services, anyone in the appraisal and real estate ecosystem. And there are complaints against AMCs that are adjudicated by the state regulators. That's where bad AMCs, quote, bad AMCs, have to account for their actions.
Okay, well, I think we're just about out of time. I want to thank our viewers for tuning in today. I want to especially thank our speakers, Craig and John. As I stated at the beginning, there'll be a recording of this session also posted on the LAI YouTube, LAI website through its YouTube link. We are hoping to organize one final session in this series, and that's one that would bring a speaker representing an advocate for those who have been hurt or injured by appraisal bias, and we will hope to announce that in the coming year. We will certainly let all of you know about it when we have such a thing. And again, thank you to everyone today.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you to LAI for helping us articulate in the public space sort of the state of the industry and the challenges appraisers face.
Yes, second that.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
very much.